Today is May 29th, 2024, and my guest is economist Michael Munger of Duke University. This is Mike's 47th appearance on EconTalk, which is roughly once every 20 episodes, or a little over twice a year. Mike was last here in September of 2023 talking about Adam Smith and the trolley problem. Mike, welcome back to EconTalk.
It's a pleasure, Russ. Thank you.
Our topic for today is government failure based on a paper of yours co-authored with William Keach. Bill Keach was a friend of both of ours who has sadly since passed away. Your title is a riff on an older paper about market failure. Market failure is a term that's used frequently by economists. I thought we might start there and talk about what market failure is and what you're trying to, how you're trying to respond to that.
Yeah, let me say something about how we came to this. As you said, Bill Keach was a mutual friend of ours. We actually, the three of us got together once, I think, at the Southern meetings and had some very nice scotch during the conference. I'm very sad that I did not get a picture of you and Bill together. It wouldn't quite be Friedman and Stigler, but it would be close. Bill was 6'8", just shockingly tall. In fact, Bill and I used to carpool to Duke. And surprisingly, the car that Bill had was a Mini Cooper. Now, the reason he had a Mini Cooper was that the front seat would go all the way back on top of the back seat. And that meant that uniquely, that car meant his enormous 6'8" legs would fit in. So one day, Bill and I pulled into a parking space and a woman was walking just in front of us, heading towards the office. And just by accident, Bill and I both abruptly got out at the same time. I'm not a small man and Bill's 6'8". She actually stopped and looked and said, "Are there more?" She thought it was a clown car because a Mini Cooper is very small. So Bill, I wanted to give the idea of Bill had a manner of speaking that was something like Eeyore, where everything is bad. But if you talk to him, he actually had a great sense of humor. He did die recently, and part of the reason that I had brought this up, that we might talk about it, Russ, was that 10 years ago, this very day, Bill and I were in a coffee shop at the beach in North Carolina working on this paper. And what we were struggling with was the idea of how to express the problem of government failure in a way that was on par with what you talked about when you said market failure. So market failure has a long history in economics. In some ways, the idea of market failure was prompted by the events of the late 20s and the 30s. We now call the Depression. But the question is, why are there such large fluctuations in aggregate economic activity? And so the classical explanation doesn't have a very good doesn't explain those cycles very well, the classical economic model. But the claim was you have to let prices work themselves out. And then the question in the early 30s became, is there ways that government could intervene that would either shorten the time period in which prices will work things out or reduce the amplitude of the decline in the first place? So can we make recessions shorter and shallower? And the classical response was, no, if you do that, you'll distort prices, you'll make things even worse. So this laissez-faire, this kind of hands-off approach, was difficult for politicians and for citizens to accept. And so people were casting about for ways, how can we explain these enormous fluctuations in aggregate economic activity? And do we have a way of thinking about them that will let us find points of intervention for the government? So the Austrian response to that, as you know, and Ludwig von Mises as early as 1920 had written his book on socialism, saying that the government didn't have enough information without prices. There's a variety of reasons why the government would not be able effectively to intervene. The public choice response in the late 50s and early 60s took the Austrian objection as being correct, but added an incentive problem. So I have written recently that in order to understand an economic system, you have to look with two eyes, incentives and information. And the question is, can you generate, by looking with two eyes, incentives and information, a better outcome than you would get from markets? Because markets create a set of information and markets generate information from prices. Can you do better than that? So the public choice response usually would claim that government doesn't know enough and government bureaucrats will have the wrong incentives, and so we probably can't do better. Now, there was a response that I think public choice people don't take seriously enough, and that was from the Cambridge Welfare School. And let me take just a second and explain the Cambridge Welfare School. So Oscar Lange famously said, socialists certainly have good reasons to be grateful to Professor Mises, the great devil's advocate for their cause. It was his powerful challenge that forced socialists to recognize the importance of an adequate system of economic information. So we, as a memento of the prime importance of sound economic accounting, a statue of Professor Mises ought to occupy an honorable place in the great hall of the Ministry of Socialization of the socialist state. And so his claim, what Lange claimed, was Mises is right. We may not have enough information. We need to work harder on information than we thought. Well, what information do we need? Well, when you look back, there's another school of of market failure, and that is the equilibrium people. So the Cambridge school was welfare economics. Can we have better outcomes? And the equilibrium school had to do with, will markets produce coherent outcomes or will they just be chaotic? And so Leon Walras in the late 1890s said, what must we do in order to prove that the theoretical solution of the problem of the determination of equilibrium prices is identically the solution worked out by the market? That is, we can come up with an ideal. Will the market approximate that? Our task is very simple. We need only show the upward and downward movement of prices solve the system of equations of offer and demand by a process of groping. Now, in French, groping is par tâtonnement. So tâtonnement is the process by which markets are going to discover the correct prices. What's interesting is that Oscar Lange took exactly that par tâtonnement, that groping, and said that's what government should do, experimentation. So what we need to do is experiment with different policies. That is literally exactly where President Roosevelt, when he made his speech about experimentation, and where people who favor government control, government intervention in the market, they are advocating for experimentation. So the Austrian critique that government doesn't have enough information is possibly true, but the public choice, when in the 1950s, looking back, said, well, and government can't have enough information, and they also don't have the right incentives. Because when you look at Ronald Coase or Gordon Tullock, they say, well, government officials, people who advocate for government, don't recognize the political problem. What I have found is that the Cambridge economists, and A.C. Pigou in particular, very much recognize the political problem, both the incentive and the information problem. And I've actually found in a number of places where A.C. Pigou in the 1920s, should be recognized as the first public choice theorist. And I can read the quotes if you want, but I've written several things about this. What's interesting is that the Cambridge economists, the welfare school people, recognize the information problem to an extent that I think many later people didn't give them credit for. But their answer is groping. They want government to have enough power to do constant experimentation. And here's the important thing. It has to be insulated from political incentives. So it has to be completely outside of any democratic pressures. This is why during the 1930s, the Roosevelt administration, many theorists in the Roosevelt administration and people in the UK were such fans of Mussolini. Not because they wanted to be fascists, but because they recognized that the incentive problems of politics were so severe. So just one more thing, and I'll be done with my introduction, because I think this intellectual history is interesting for people who've grown up in the public choice tradition. In the public choice tradition, we are catechized to learn People who favor government intervention don't understand the information problem, and they don't understand the incentive problem. And once you put politics in, then the scales will fall from their eyes. That's not true. They actually recognize those problems before. They just have a different solution. But so there's a paper in 1938 by Abram Bergson that isn't often read anymore, but should be. So in 1938, Bergson said, if the production functions and individual indifference functions are known, they provide sufficient information concerning the economic welfare function for the determination of the maximum position if it exists. All the details, all of them, are just matters of implementation. So
that's the silliest thing I've ever heard. But go ahead.
It was in the American Economic Review. It was the standard. So you say it's silly. We don't read that. When I say, that's what people used to believe, people never believed that. They did. That was literally what they believed.
Let me just clarify for non-economists in the audience why I think it's silly and what Bergson was saying. What we're talking about here, what I understand you to be talking about, Mike, is this question of, can the government outperform the private sector, either by taking on some of its tasks or by improving, by intervening, by regulating, subsidizing, taxing, the choices that would emerge from a market private choice, set of private activities. And to be clear, neither of us is an anarchist, or when we talk about private outcomes or market outcomes, we're not talking about literally unregulated. Of course, government is playing a role in property rights, deterring fraud, perhaps through the courts and so on. We're talking about the next level of government intervention, which would be subsidies, taxes, regulation, or taking nationalization, taking over a task that private sector might not to be doing well. So those are the kind of things that we're talking about. And the goal in the abstract, and that's very important, in the abstract, when economists are writing about this, they're asking the question, if government intervenes, taxes, subsidies, regulation, taking over a task, can government outperform the private sector? And one of the huge problems I have, and we'll probably get to it, but we might not, is that just defining what outperform means is very complicated. Does it mean every single person is better off? Does it mean that the benefits to those who are better off are at least as large as the harm to those who are worse off? Those would be two obvious things you could look at. But the reason I said that about the Bergson thing, read the first sentence again.
If the production functions and individual indifference functions are known, they
stop. So the production function is an absurd idea that Arnold Kling has talked about.
I can write it down. I can put it on a blackboard.
Yes, you can.
You used to do it. Russ Roberts, 1992.
What he's claiming there is that we can treat everything the economy produces, goods and services, as a mathematical equation where we combine workers, resources, and capital to make stuff. And stuff is capital S. So we want to have a lot of stuff to allocate to the citizens. And in this story, which is not which is in my mind an absurd story, this story says two things. We're going to, if we know how much we can make, where how much is literally a scalar, S, 53 units. And if we know how much people like the different parts of S, guns and butter say, then we can figure out how to make everybody maximally happy, a phrase which sounds reasonable and actually makes no sense in my view, but it's a Benthamite utilitarian idea. But there's a phrase in there that I had to stop you short on, which is, if we knew people's indifference, do you say curves or functions? Function. What he means by that, which is a totally confusing phrase for a non-economist, but what he means by that is, if we know how much people like different things, that is to say, if I give you, Mike, 3 hamburgers a week, how many, and I'm going to take, you're eating 3 hamburgers a week, I'm going to take them away and I'm going to give you a certain number of soy patties. How many do I have to give you to make you indifferent to your loss of 3 hamburgers? that's a formal concept in economics captured by something called an indifference curve. Of course, they can't be known. They can't be known by the government. They cannot be. The government cannot know how much Mike Munger likes guns versus butter, meat versus soy, vegetables versus cheese, and even Mike might not know, which is a different, even bigger problem. That's the so-called information problem that you've been talking about. We don't have complete information at any one time about how much people like different stuff. So the idea that we could allocate the stuff to the people in a way that makes them as happy as possible is, to start with, a meaningless idea because of that lack of information. And James Buchanan went on to say, which is a wonderful 2-page, 3-page piece, that we only find out what people like in the process of, and how they respond to change in the process of them going through it. Okay, so that's my first footnote, but I want to add one more thing and let you carry on. Your claim, which I've never heard before, of tâtonnement, which is groping or heading toward or trying to get to, the idea that that process would be trial and error is fascinating, because one of the most powerful aspects of private decision-making is it's often driven by trial and error, and then competition among different types of trial and error determines how stuff gets chosen, which product wins, or which product has a bigger market share, or how much of a resource gets devoted to an activity, or whether a new product can survive. Maybe in this version it won't, but eventually there'll be an innovation that'll make it possible. And you can't write that on a blackboard. Typically, it's through trial and error. We had an episode with Matt Ridley where we talked about this in great detail, how the Wright brothers, they didn't sit down and figure out the best way to fly. They tried a bunch of different stuff, and most of it didn't work. And then something did. And that's often the less romantic but actual way that product innovation occurs. The idea that the government could do that, especially that it could do it insulated from the political pressure that politicians would face, the idea that there would be a technocratic alternative to the messy, chaotic, dog-eat-dog competition of the private sector is fascinating. And listeners may remember one of my favorite moments in EconTalk when I debated Robert Frank about infrastructure. And we'll put a link to that episode. And basically, I think Robert Frank said, well, we just need a committee of experts to decide what infrastructure is needed. Don't pick politicians. I said, we already have that. It's called the Senate, or the Congress. And he said, no, they're not that. We'll have a committee of experts who would be insulated from political considerations and would simply pick the amount we should spend on bridges, roads, sewage, etc. And that will be better than the messy government solution, and much better than a private solution in this case, because there's a market failure. There's no way that private sector activity will generate the right amount of infrastructure. So, end of speech.
What you just said is literally my discovery. And it's a stupid discovery because everyone who had done the reading already knew. And the discovery is that I found this out from my Duke colleague, Steve Medema, who is, by the way, I have my own podcast called The Answer is Transaction Cost. And the most recent Tidy C, Medema and I talk about Pigou and transaction costs and RH Coase. Backhouse and Medema wrote a paper about the Cambridge economists' view of groping and tâtonnement in the 20s and 30s. And it is explicitly there. They read Valra and they said, that'll work. What we need is not a government committee that will make the final choice. What we need is a government committee of experts that will manage the inevitable problem of choosing, making mistakes, and then updating, because these experts can do it better than the sort of blind groping of the market, which doesn't have any telos. Markets are evolution.
No goal.
Yeah, there's nothing that normatively it is trying to accomplish. Survival is the only thing markets do.
And that the they in the sentence that you just finished is the Cambridge economists, not the two authors of the paper.
What they wanted was really smart, able people, and the Cambridge economists saw those in the mirror every morning. Yes. And so it was pretty clear who they intended. They didn't say me, and yes, you're right. What Backhouse and Medema are doing is just documenting the fact is that the Cambridge welfare economists fully, in fact, surprisingly fully recognized both the information and incentive problems as early as 1920. But their solution was one that for some reason most of us have ignored. So can I read something this is from a paper by Danny Roderick in 2014. The case against industrial policy, and industrial policy is a form of government activity to improve the working of markets, specifically by picking winners and losers and subsidizing those industries which ought, from a positive perspective, to be, we want green energy, we want better things, we want to get rid of coal. Market system won't do that fast enough, and so industrial policy will do it. So the case against industrial policy comes in two forms. The first is that governments do not have the information needed to make the right choices as to which firms or industries to support. The second is that once governments are in the business of supporting this or that industry, they invite rent-seeking and political manipulation by well-connected firms and lobbyists. Industrial policy becomes driven by political rather than economic motives. Exactly right. I mean, that is the public choice objection. He has stated it fairly. I contend the first claim is largely irrelevant. And the reason is he wants experimentation.
He being Roderick.
He being Roderick, he being Frank, he being Pigou, he being everyone in the Cambridge Welfare School. This is a 100-year-old tradition. It's not something new. I just have not recognized it enough until now. It was new to me maybe 10 years ago when I was working on this paper.
Mike, you have many personal failings, of course, but I would suggest that you're not alone in failing to appreciate the prescience and achievement of the Cambridge Welfare School in anticipating these objections. And again, it's just to reemphasize the point, it remains the question as to whether their answer works. But
it's a different question. It is a different question. You're right. Empirically, they may be mistaken and it won't work. But it's a different objection than the sort of stupid one that I have made until fairly recently. Oh, they just don't understand politics. They understood it perfectly, and they understood it 100 years ago. So Roderick says, I contend the first about information is largely irrelevant. Well, the second about political influence can be overcome with appropriate institutional design. Good industrial policy does not rely on government's omniscience or ability to pick winners. Mistakes are an inevitable and necessary part of a well-designed industrial policy program. In fact, too few mistakes are a sign of underperformance. So the more mistakes you make, the better, because that means you're trying more hard stuff. So that is...
Sorry, I just want to emphasize I don't know if we were going to get to this, but one of the standard critiques of the market is people look at some outcome and say, oh, look how horrible that is. And therefore government should intervene. This has now been flipped on its head. The market people look at this government activity, industrial policy, urban renewal, public schools, and their answer is, oh, well, sure, it doesn't work every time. How could it? Which, of course, is what the market people say. It's reality, isn't it? And then the response of the government interventionist is, we just now need to do it better. We've got more information. Of course, it doesn't work every time. Now is our chance to improve it.
But let's be fair. What they're saying is mistakes are going to happen under either system, markets or government. The question is, which system can learn better and faster? And markets, you have to wait for someone else to try something. Now, you said it's been flipped on its head. Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, before he took office, made a speech that was based explicitly on this viewpoint, where he said, we're going to make lots of mistakes. We're going to have systematic experimentation, and we're going to make lots of mistakes. It is based explicitly on this view that that's how we're going to learn. And so we are finally now starting to turn towards the Keach Munger article about government failure, because what Keach and I wanted to do was to put these two systems on more or less an equal footing and recognize that the people who advocate for government failure the people that are arguing for government intervention are doing it in a way where their claims about information, their claims about incentives are much more sophisticated than until now, I think we have realized.
And to give the government intervention position its due, and I didn't mean to suggest that my raised voice or ranting a minute ago was to mock it. I find it quite interesting, these parallels. But to take another step in their direction, the interventionists, correctly point out that the private decision-making and the private outcomes have a different kind of incentive problem, which is that the producers of the goods, the owners of the companies, are self-interested, greedy, and have an incentive to exploit their customers and their workers. And you and I look at that and say, well, of course they do. Adam Smith recognized that, and I'm sure it's probably in the Bible. But the point is that for you and me, I'll speak only for me. For me, of course that's true. It's competition that constrains the greed and self-interest, and that turns it into a force to serve the customer. And then there's a separate question. Well, what's enough competition? And should the government intervene to achieve that through antitrust laws, regulation, and other things? But the idea that the private sector has lousy incentives is certainly true. And our position that government bureaucrats have bad incentives because they do not have skin in the game is also true. So both sides are correct. The incentives of the people making the decisions are deeply flawed. And then becomes a question of, in what situations are those incentives improved either by the constraints of competition in the case of private decision-making, or by noble desires, elections as a constraint on political nefariousness, corruption, rent-seeking, and so on. And I guess I'm going to, spoiler, tell you where I come down most of the time. Not all the time, of course, but much of the time, my difference with people who want to intervene more than I do is my belief that the private market competition outperforms the political market competition of elections and better, more noble sentiments that some politicians might have.
Yes. Okay. So you said a bunch of things. Let me break it out a little bit. First, when it comes to market failures, not all listeners may recognize what that term of art means. So one of the problems is that if a firm has market power, it may be able to exploit that market power in terms of higher prices, lower wages. So that has to be disciplined by competition. And so one government action might be antitrust or competition policy. That is to make sure that that system works effectively, exactly to make sure that markets work well. Another is asymmetric information, where sellers have better information about the product than consumers do. That is a market failure in the sense that consumers then are not really willing to pay much for these products, and a bunch of mutually beneficial transactions will fail to take place. So government licensing, like airline pilots or meat inspection, things like that, will actually allow the market to perform better. The third is the problem that self-interest will lead me to disregard costs that are paid by other members of society, but not by buyers or sellers. And then using taxes to cause me to internalize those things like pollution to get prices right. In fact, the whole point of that market failure perspective is for government to get prices right. They're relying on the market. They want to make the market work better. And then the final one is activities that would benefit us from cooperating, but that we will underproduce because it's too difficult to charge a price for. And those things are called public goods. And so having the government provide those things and then collect fees called taxes in order to finance them is something that we all might unanimously support, because we would like to see those things provided, and they'll be underprovided by markets. So competition policy and monopoly, asymmetric information, externalities like pollution, and public goods are the four kinds of market failures. Those would indicate some possible place for government action. And the thing is that I need to now go back 100 years to Arthur Cecil Pigou, because he recognized all of this. You just gave the orthodox public choice response. Politics is going to screw this up. And in fact, democracy is going to screw it up more than markets. He agreed completely. That's why expertise has to be placed beyond the reach of democracy.
Yeah, I just want to footnote. I didn't say all the time. I just said sometimes. Go ahead.
Well, that's the point is that for the Cambridge welfare economists, that's not the relevant comparison. They want to end democracy in this realm, because voters, if they have any sense, will recognize they will be better off creating a clerisy, basically a priesthood of PhD economists and experts that will be beyond the power of democracy to change, that will make these decisions.
And similarly, we've heard this in many situations in healthcare. The question of healthcare is one of the questions that when you have a public system of healthcare, what should be covered by the public insurance? What techniques should be covered? What pharmaceuticals should be covered? What procedures should be covered? And of course, the hospitals have an incentive to do lots of things if the government's going to pay for it, as do consumers. So you have to find a constraint if it's not going to be price, right? In a true private system, which of course is not true in the United States, but if you had an actual market system, something like the United States in 1940 or 50, say, then there'd be some restraint on activity by rationing through prices. Many people find that offensive. So they say, okay, the government should cover it. It shouldn't be up to what you can afford. But then you have the problem that everybody wants everything. So we have to decide now, some things are not effective enough, and therefore they should be not covered. And who should decide that? A committee of experts.
Yeah.
And who are those experts, of course? Doctors.
We recognize who the experts are because we see them in the mirror.
Right. Yeah. But the ideal, and again, we all understand how appealing this is. The ideal of who should or how that decision should be made of what should be covered requires medical expertise. I would add it also requires some understanding of trade-offs, uncertainty, incentives, and so on. And that's generally not available to doctors. So therefore, I think that system has many problems. And of course, very few people are unaffected by incentives, ever. The idea that somehow these experts will be locked away and untampered with, the clerisy, the priesthood, is such a beautiful idea. Whether it's realistic or not may depend on a vision of human nature that is not viable. But that's the question.
Doesn't have to be perfect. It only has to be better than markets.
Good point.
So I have to make my usual point in reverse. Markets don't have to be perfect to be better than democracy. Well, experts don't have to be better than democracy either, because so let me go back to Pigou, and I want to read a couple of quotes, and this is from the 1920s and 1930s. I apologize to the listeners for so many quotes, but most of you have never heard this before. And I think it's a real problem with the way that public choice and economic education has been conducted. So Pigou said, in any industry where there is reason to believe that the free play of self-interest will cause an amount of resources to be invested different from the amount that is required in the best interest of the national dividend, there is a prima facie case for public intervention. So
read that again. It's a little convoluted, but the idea of it is a nice capsule of what we're trying to talk about here. Read it again.
In any industry where there is reason to believe that the free play of self-interest will cause an amount of resources to be invested different from the amount that is required in the best interest of the national dividend.
So there's an ideal, what we would call an optimum amount. And if it's not if private decision makers don't choose that amount, there's a case for government intervention.
There is a prima facie case for public intervention. That is, prima facie means in this case, it passes the sort of first level. The presumption is going to be in favor of government intervention. And so he had also said, again, from Pigou, we don't read Pigou enough. We ought to read Pigou. So
speak for yourself.
No,
I got a lot of things to read. Pigou's not up on my list. Well, make the case.
In graduate school. So again, from Pigou, one person A, in the course of rendering some service for which payment is made to a second person B, incidentally also renders services or disservices to other persons of such a sort that payment cannot be exacted from the benefited parties or compensation enforced on behalf of the injured parties. To ascertain how far the free play of self-interest, acting under the existing legal system, tends to distribute the country's resources in the ways most favorable to the production of a large national dividend, and how far it is feasible for state action to improve upon natural tendencies, should be our objective. And so what his point is, that's
about externalities.
It is about externalities, but it's under the existing legal system. What he wants to do is change the property rights system so that we get better outcomes. He wants to get prices right. He has an economist intuition about this. He thinks democracy can't do it. So here's the hammer. 1912. This is 1912 from Pigou. So the case cannot become more than a prima facie one. So we read before, he'd established something's prima facie. Now, that's not per se. That doesn't mean it wins. That means prima facie means on its face, you say, okay, that makes sense so far. Now prove it. The case cannot become more than a prima facie one until we have considered the qualifications which governmental agencies may be expected to possess for intervening advantageously in this class of matter. This next paragraph that I'm going to read, and again, I apologize for reading so much, but it's important.
But before you read the next one, to give readers a chance to rewind and hear that again if they want, that it's 1912. It's not just that it's 112 years ago. There aren't very many agencies. I mean, there were some set up in the late 1880s and 90s, but he's imagining a regulatory body, a set of regulatory bodies, and he's trying to say, well, who should be on those regulatory commissions, and what should their skills be? What do they need to know?
This is his solution. That even in 1912, when he's first writing, this is the solution. Markets fail. We don't have that really worked out yet, but he's prescient about these problems with markets. What we need is a set of experts to solve these problems. What sort of qualifications would those agencies have? What rules should they have? How could this work? And this, I sometimes will put this up and ask people to identify it as a quote and say, which of Hayek's works does this come from? This is Pigou in 1912. And it gives me goosebumps to read. It is not sufficient to contrast the imperfect adjustments of unfettered private enterprise with the best adjustments that economists in their studies can imagine. So economists sit in their studies. That is literally their study. Where I am, this is my study. You can see it behind me, all these books. I've got my desk. I sit here. I can imagine improvements on the market system. That's not good enough, says Pigou. It's you being able to imagine it doesn't help. It is not sufficient to contrast the imperfect adjustment of unfettered private enterprise with the best adjustment that economists in their studies can imagine. For we cannot expect that any state authority will attain or even wholeheartedly seek that ideal. Government won't do what you imagine that they should do. Such authorities are liable alike to ignorance, information problem, to sectional pressure, democracy, and to personal corruption by private interest, incentives.
Only choice.
Yes. That in 1912, he invented public choice. A loud-voiced part of their constituents, if organized for votes, may easily outweigh the whole. The mischaracterization of Pigou by Coase, the nearly tendentious portrayal of Pigou's view in Coase's 1960 paper this is something that my friend Steve Medema often writes about, and I've actually come over to his side. Coase did many great things, good for him, but I think a lot of our misunderstanding of Pigou comes from Coase describing what Pigou said. It's not unlike Keynes's mischaracterization of say. Most people don't read say, they read what Keynes says say said, which is a sentence I've never said before. What Keynes says that say said, and Keynes gets it wrong in a way that benefits Keynes's argument. Say doesn't say that. Well, Pigou doesn't say what Coase said he said. And I think once we start to take that seriously, we have to recognize that we need to rethink the problem of government action, and therefore we have to rethink the problem of government failure.
I just want to first point out, I think Pigou is a student of Marshall.
Yes.
And there's a story, which I may have told on the program or not, I can't remember, where Marshall would come to class and Pigou was the only student. I don't know if that was every week or every session, but at least some or much or all the time. Marshall would come to the front of the lecture hall, to the stage, and spread his notes. And in the front row, probably, I assume, although maybe it was in the middle, sat Arthur Cecil Pigou, A.C. Pigou, and Marshall lectured at him. I don't know if there was any Socratic questioning or class discussion, but it was an unusual tutorial as I was wherever I read that or heard that. So I think the idea...
May I say that for those who might work on the drinking game, they might add that, because I believe that's the fourth time that you have told that story on EconTalk. And so once it's been told 4 times, it can appear on the drinking game. I think that's the Mendoza line.
But I wanted to add one clarification, which is not a clarification, just again, a footnote. The 1960 paper that you're referring to is The Problem of Social Cost, where Coase takes Pigou to account and says Pigou's solution for dealing with the externalities, which were taxes and subsidies, is wrong. There's a richer way to look at that, and Coase then expands on that. It's probably the most influential. Might be the single most influential paper in economics. It's way up there. It's definitely in the top 10, top 5 in terms of citations and actual influence, whether you can measure or not. I'd say it's 5-ish. And you're saying that that's kind of a straw man caricature of Pigou's view of market failure. So Coase said, Pigou thought markets fail, and the way you fix it is government intervenes in this taxes or subsidies. And you're saying that there really was a cheap shot at Pigou's nuanced understanding of this problem. And I would just add that Coase has been a guest. Coase is gone, but he was a guest on EconTalk. I was sad to say Pigou never will be. He's long gone. So what Pigou's saying there is markets fail, governments fail, and therefore we need a third thing. That's what I hear you're saying, Mike. Is that fair?
Not only a third thing, we don't know what that third thing is yet, and that should not distress us because we can only discover it par tâtonnement. We need to devise a new set of government institutions based on expertise that will guide markets correctly by getting prices right. And
going back to the Robert Frank conversation, Robert Frank was saying in that, down to give him his due, he was saying that, of course, politicians will not be good judges of how much we need to spend on infrastructure.
Yeah.
We should use, I say this with a straight face, engineers. Now, that has its own problem, which I would suggest, I'm guessing, Pigou recognized, perhaps. No? maybe.
Of course he recognized it. Absolutely, he recognized it. So did Danny Roderick. The fact that there are problems doesn't mean we can't solve them. We have to start making more mistakes.
Yeah,
So,
and by the way, the extreme caricature of this, which I find, to be honest, deeply offensive, is Thomas Friedman's argument, which I think is not a straw man argument. I mean, I think it's not. I'm not straw manning Thomas Friedman. Thomas Friedman has written, sure, China's a horrible government in many ways, but you got to give them one thing: they can get stuff done. And if we could just have like a day in the United States where we could just like cut through all this red tape and political log rolling and other problems that democracies have to cope with, man, it'd be great because we could get so much done like the Chinese. And no comment. I'm just you can comment if you want.
Well, I was so taken by that view, which is actually quite common. Thomas Friedman did say it, but many people have said something like that. So I wrote a paper, and maybe you can put it up in show notes, which is the title of it is "A Good Industrial Policy is Impossible in a Democracy." And the argument is, suppose you favor industrial policy. And suppose, for the sake of argument, that there is an industrial policy which would improve on markets. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that's true. It will not be implemented in a democracy. So your solutions are to accept an inferior industrial policy, in which case, why do it? Or to end democracy, which means we have China. And you can't do it for a day. It doesn't switch back. If you end democracy, that's the end of democracy.
But now I'm going to critique my own critique, which is, like, I'm making fun of, I really haven't had a chance to do the kind of mockery and cruel, sardonic cynicism of these kind of solutions that I would really enjoy if you and I were having that scotch again. So, but let me make fun of myself, which is, what I'm saying here is that I really am not a big fan of a committee of engineers to decide how much infrastructure we need, or economists to decide how much of X we need, whether it's industrial policy or anything else. But the truth is that every once in a while, democracies do exactly what Pigou was talking about. And the case that comes to mind is you have to close some military bases. The Cold War is over. We got too many bases. And of course, in a democracy, every member of Congress who's got a base in his or her backyard is going to go to the fight to the death for it, and the senators will fight to the death for it. And so everybody recognizes that. So they solve that problem. They create a commission, which is a, quote, committee of experts, and they say it's imperfect, but it's probably an improvement. And they say, look, make some recommendations about, you could argue it's not plausible, but the idea is it makes some recommendations about what's best for our military capability at a lower level, which bases should be closed, and I'm guessing it's an up or down vote either by the president or by some committee, because you don't want to then open it up to like, no. What about this one or that one? Here's our recommendation, take it or leave it. And I think that's what we've done in the United States a number of times.
That example,
and it's a good idea.
Your example is too narrow. The Federal Reserve is a priesthood of experts which are appointed, not elected, for a fixed term. They can't be removed from office. And the reason was that politicians, democracy, recognized that the incentives to renege on the promise not to inflate their way out of debt was not credible. And so we'll have a priesthood of experts that will do this, that will make the promise not to inflate more or less credible. We have the Supreme Court, which is a priesthood of experts which are appointed for life and cannot be removed. So this happens a lot, actually. So we can make fun of the idea, but the fact is, they're right. The people who make this argument, empirically, at least there is some case to be made for this is an alternative to either markets or politics.
Again, you might want to rewind, listeners, or review the transcript. There's a 3-word phrase that Mike used there about credible claims not to overinflate. You said more or less, because of course, even the Fed, although for whatever reason, has struggled to avoid inflationary finance, and has other issues with, say, coddling Wall Street and other challenges. But again, I think I've spent a lot of effort and pages and writing in my book on the financial crisis, making fun of that kind of thing and other things like it. But the fact is, that's not the right standard, is what I'm learning from this. And I know it in some sense, but I'm being forced to recognize it here, which is it's not so much that the Fed's flawed. It is flawed. The question is whether it's better than a monetary policy that would be run by Congress or the president. The answer is yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
Is it better than private money? Well, so we have friends, you and I have friends who would argue no, but I don't think it's so much worse than private money. It's a pretty good system.
Well, and the Food and Drug Administration, for the way that drugs are allowed to be sold in the United States.
Perfect example.
The licensing system for pilots. That is, can you fly an airplane? We could just have competition, and we could judge between airlines based on how many fatal crashes they've had in the last year. They'd have a reputation for having better pilots. That's pretty expensive. So instead, we have commissions of experts.
A.C. Pigou might have pointed out that if you have no crashes, which is often a year of flight in the United States, it's too onerous, the standards.
I thought you were going to say there's not enough experimentation. I was hoping you would not. No crashes mean not enough experimentation. You should be.
That's what he might say. But I'll leave that as an exercise for the reader.
Well, so the interesting thing about where we have come is that the usual separation between markets and politics, where markets are probably going to perform better than democracy in deciding how to allocate resources, was not only conceded by the Cambridge welfare economists, they anticipated public choice arguments by 60 or 70 years. They just had a different solution. Their solution was to have commissions of experts whose job it will be in each sector to get prices right. Now, I happen to think that may not work very well, but you said before, that's actually an empirical question. That's a very different criticism than the usual criticism that's made, which is to say, yes, government will get prices wrong because they'll be using democracy. Well, if they're using experts, maybe they can do better. Then we have to take seriously this question of whether government intervention is going to improve on market outcomes. So this leads us, if we can spend 10 minutes on it, to the actual paper that Keach and I wrote about government failure. And
we can, but I have a case study I want to close with.
Please.
But I'll let. We will take that 10 minutes, and then I'll give my case study, and I think you will enjoy it, and you'll react to it.
All right, thank you. So what Keach and I pointed out was, and what actually sort of pissed us off at the beginning, was the caricature.
You mean annoyed you?
Yeah, it annoyed me. It may have done something else to Bill, but it just annoyed me. Yes, the usual story of government failure in the public policy literature is to limit government failure to the failure to correct market failure. That was a bunch of words. Let me say it again. So markets fail. Markets fail. We've talked about the 4 ways that they do that. Government's job then is to correct those 4 things so as to perfect the system and approximate the best equilibrium which might exist. And what we've shown is that this equilibrium exists. The first and second welfare theorem have certain properties. We know what to do. Markets fall short of that. Government policy will improve, will get us there. Now, governments will fail because they will fall short of perfecting those things. And the question is, how can we work on that? That notion of government failure is nonsense if you talk to a political scientist or a political theorist. Governments are fully capable of failing entirely on their own. If you look at, there's a book called Democide. If you look at the great genocides and disasters of the 19th and 20th centuries, they're all perpetrated by states, by government. The mass starvations, the mass executions, the failure to govern returning us to a Hobbesian state of nature, something like Somalia. Those, Keach and I wanted to say, are substantive government failures. And there are a number of substantive government failures that we want to raise as being the main functions of government. Governments that do not do these things fail. So, regulation of a financial system, the availability of a reliable, independent system for adjudicating disputes, so a judiciary, stability of the currency, the ability to control the expansion of debt to secure modest interest rates, the incapacity to provide the basic state function of controlling the border, and the incapacity to keep order and enforce the laws. So that doesn't necessarily mean the laws are good or bad, but just the usual kind of law and order, be able to go to court and fairly quickly be able to adjudicate disputes. Now, the state might choose private agencies to do that. You might have something like the law merchant. You might have a public judicial system. But the point is, our claim is politics comes first. That is, politics sets the basic rules of the game, and then markets, exchange at scale, take place within those basic institutions. And governments, and this is a Doug North perspective, I'll admit, so I'm biased by that. And listeners who've heard a lot of mine will now be able to drink, because I always mention Doug North, and this is relatively late in the podcast by that standard. So having made fun of you, I'll make fun of myself. So the context, the institutions that determine how markets function, government is responsible for at least maintaining those. They may not establish them. They may come down to us from the traditions of the past, like the common law, but maintaining them and making sure that they function, that's a government role. And so governments fail when they fail to do any of those substantive things. Now, there's a second category of government failure, and that's procedural. The procedures that government either chooses or, again, maintains have to do with the ability to choose between Pareto optima, and that's a technical term. Often, the efficiency standard in markets will say what we need to do is make sure we end up at a Pareto optimum. Pareto optimum just means that there's no waste. It's efficient in the sense that all mutually beneficial transactions actually take place. Now, they can't all take place because there's frictions within the system, but for the most part, any cooperation or exchange that would make people mutually better off is allowed to or is encouraged to take place. If that doesn't happen, then we often call that some kind of failure, be it market or government. Well, the question is, we usually have to choose between Pareto optima. Let's suppose that we're considering building a dam. The dam will be financed out of general tax revenue. There's a number of people, all of whom will pay the same amount to finance the dam. The dam will create electric power that all of us will be able to use, but some people who now live in the watershed that will be flooded by the dam will lose their homes. You know, they've lived there a long time. They don't want the dam. They're relatively small in number. There's a lot of people who benefit from the dam. How should we decide which of these two Pareto optima we should pick? And Keach and I suggest there's 5 different procedures we might use, and we show that each of those procedures is not likely to choose the Pareto optimal outcome. Now, that is an analogy to the market failure analysis, because markets generally do not pick, in the case of market failure, they don't pick the Pareto optimal outcome. The discovery process for government, it could be voting, it could be bureaucracy, where we do cost-benefit analysis, but people misrepresent their preferences, though they have the information problem, the demand revelation problem. So in terms of a short summary, what we do is we say the job of government is to choose between Pareto optima. Can it do that? And given the procedures available to it, our answer is no. Well, then the empirical question is the one that you and I have already talked about. In a particular case, given that both systems are going to fail in the sense they fall short of approximating the utopian ideal of frictionless, full information, benevolent dictator, which one's going to do empirically better. So we're thrown back on our resources of trying to decide case by case. So the case that Keach and I were trying to make is, if you put these things on an equal footing and you're comparing their ability to achieve Pareto optimality, neither markets nor politics can possibly do that. And so the market failure approach, which usually says markets fail, therefore the state should act, is mistaken. But it's also mistaken to say governments fail, therefore markets should act. We're put in the position of having to make a case-by-case comparison based on the empirical observation, which performs better.
There's a general feeling that certain bureaucracies work better than others. And it may be romance. It may be that we romanticize, say, European bureaucracy, where, say, compared to American. European bureaucracy, there's more respect it's claimed for the European bureaucrats, the people in civil service, whereas the United States, they're looked down on. Underlying this procedural question of how to intervene and inevitably imperfectly, but how to intervene, it might be worth looking at how to make the bureaucracy more effective or more honorable, to draw more talented people into it, or pay a higher salary to draw more talented people into it. And I think which is another aspect of this, I think the outcomes that such bureaucracies, or the administrative state, to take another term, that they produce, there's a lot of devil in those details of how those bureaucracies actually work. It's easy to wave your hands as an economist or political science and say, well, they don't have great incentives or information, so they don't work very well. Okay, fine. Is there a way to make them work better? Is there a way to improve them? My only view on this is that government should do the things it does best and focus on those things rather than trying to be all things to all people and be mediocre at it. And I think how effective or creative government bureaucracy is an untouched topic.
It's certainly a very difficult topic. Having been myself the dean of the Master of Public Administration program at UNC Chapel Hill, a place you and I share in a way. That was something we were very concerned about, was the norm, what we called the norms of the guild. And one of the things you need to recognize is that the reason that you have power is that you don't use it outside of your area of expertise. So there's a famous saying about the Supreme Court that the river cannot rise above its source. And so the source of the delegation of authority is, we're going to entrust you to do the following things. You cannot, if you try to use that authority in a way that exceeds the reason for the delegation, the river is risen above its source and it will flood backwards. And you're not going to make any, you're going to lose your legitimacy. So the perception, right or wrong, particularly after COVID, is that the medical establishment in the United States exceeded its authority. They tried to rise above the source of the delegation and to control society in a way that exceeded their mandate. And so that is something that at least people used to worry about for the norms of the guild. I think that the cult of expertise in the United States had become so self-regarding that the level of self-regard had become excessive. And the result is they've actually lost a lot of their esteem and authority. But you can see it in economists also. What Danny Roderick says is that the second concern about political influence can be overcome with appropriate institutional design. He's just saying, well, let's rewrite the Constitution. No, you don't just get to rewrite the Constitution. That's not how it works. So if experts want to have authority that is delegated to them within a particular area, maybe we can do that. If you think, well, we'll just rewrite the Constitution, who's this we? Why do you think anybody will go along with that? Is there anything in your actual practical experience that makes you think that rewriting the Constitution will make it better instead of worse? That just seems like nonsense to me. So the big problem that I have is when experts say that it's really just a problem of institutional design to give me enough authority that I can do good. And my conception of doing good is so encompassing that I will actually it will expand, it will metastasize beyond the original mandate, at which point it will collapse. So the question is, why has that not happened so much in Europe and Japan? So France, Germany, Japan are the three places where if you look at surveys, the level of respect for government bureaucrats is highest. In the United States, it used to approximate that up until the 70s. Then the aftermath of the Vietnam War, and then more recently in the aftermath of COVID, we're not doing very well. Our experts are not esteemed, they're not respected, and as a result, we're thrown back on democracy, which in my mind is probably even worse. We've talked about markets, experts, and politics. There is a fourth category that Richard Cornell called the independent sector or voluntary private associations, and it dates back to Alexis de Tocqueville, who said that the particular genius of the United States was that whereas in France, maybe you see a school that's falling down, not working very well, we would say the state should do something. Well, in the US, we'll form a committee, we'll raise donations, and we'll pay money for this school. So Tocqueville was worried that this was a problem with democracy. And he said that democracy could enfeeble this voluntary impulse because I pay taxes. So I don't know the French word, but the word he used is translated as enfeebled. So everyone has this impulse. But government can crowd out that impulse because I think, well, I already gave it the office. I paid my tax money. Dang, the government is doing a bad job. What can I do? Well, the answer is often you can do many things. While you can't solve all the problems, you can do something. But notice what I'm talking about now. I'm talking about public sector experimentation. So having myself said, we need markets, now you and I are talking about different kinds of public sector experimentation, which actually lends credence to the view that I have long criticized. And I guess that's where I think we might work towards an ending here, is having thought about this, having myself worked on the problem of government failure quite a bit, I think the straw manning of the sort of Cambridge economist view that still plays out in the form of Robert Frank, Danny Roderick, and many people that I respect and like. This idea of experimentation in the public sector is one that should not be dismissed and probably should be embraced.
My guest today has been Michael Munger. Mike, as always, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Such a pleasure, Russ. Be safe.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.